Welcome back to the Ghastly Journal, where we uncover the darkest stories hidden in the shadows. Tonight, we venture into the forgotten wilderness of early Kentucky, where the whispers of a settlement long abandoned still echo through the Cumberland foothills. In the year 1809, when Kentucky remained a rugged frontier at the edge of a young nation, there stood a cluster of cabins known as the Merritt settlement, founded by Jeremiah Merritt, a taciturn veteran of the Revolution, who led 12 families westward with promises of fertile land and freedom from the encroaching industrialization of the East. The settlement took root in a valley where morning mist clung to ancient oaks, like specters reluctant to surrender to daylight. The Merritt settlement prospered modestly in those early years. The soil proved generous, yielding corn and tobacco in abundance. Game was plentiful in the surrounding forests, and a spring of sweet water bubbled from limestone formations at the valley's edge. By all accounts, Providence had smiled upon their enterprise. What distinguished the Merritt settlement from countless others scattered across the Kentucky wilderness was not its prosperity but rather the peculiar schoolhouse erected at its center. Unlike the rough-hewn structures typical of frontier education, the Merritt schoolhouse was built of stone quarried from the nearby hills, with windows of actual glass imported at great expense from Philadelphia. Inside, one room dominated the building, a chamber of unsettling symmetry, where 24 small desks stood in perfect rows upon a floor of polished pine planks stained the color of dried blood. It was in this room that Esther Merritt, the founder's spinster sister, conducted her curious method of education. Children from ages 5 to 15 gathered daily beneath her watchful gaze. Travelers passing through noted how unnaturally silent these children remained, even during recreation. Their eyes, observers remarked, held none of the mischievous light common to youth. Most disturbing was the numerical designation system Esther implemented. Each child, regardless of age, gender, or parentage, was assigned a number upon entering her classroom. These numbers, carved into wooden medallions hung around their necks, became their sole identifiers within the schoolhouse walls. Parents reported that their offspring began referring to themselves by these numbers even at home, speaking in hushed tones about teacher's arithmetic. By 1811, something had changed in the settlement. Visitors noted how the children moved in eerie unison when walking between buildings. They would recite incomprehensible mathematical formulae while performing their chores. Most disturbing were accounts of children standing motionless in the fields at dusk, faces turned toward the schoolhouse, lips moving in silent numerical incantation. When a merchant from Lexington arrived in the spring of 1812 to trade goods with the settlement, he found the cabins empty, fires long cold in their hearths. Only the stone schoolhouse remained undisturbed, its door standing open as if in invitation. Inside, the merchant discovered 24 wooden medallions arranged in a perfect circle upon the floor, each carved with a different number. The room itself bore no sign of violence or hasty departure. The ledger on Esther's desk remained open to a page filled with elaborate calculations, the final entry reading simply, "The equation is balanced. They are ready." The records of what followed remain fragmentary, scattered across the yellowed pages of county registers and the fading journals of those who dared investigate. Reverend Thomas Abernathy, dispatched by the Presbyterian Synod of Kentucky to determine the settler's fate, documented his findings in a leather-bound volume now housed in the state archives, its pages bearing the distinctive foxing of age and reluctant handling. The Reverend wrote of an unsettling stillness that pervaded the abandoned settlement, a silence unnatural even for wilderness, as though the very birds dare not sing within hearing of that accursed schoolroom. He described how the spring that once provided sweet water now ran with a faintly metallic taste, and how the previously fertile fields had grown fallow with peculiar geometric patterns, visible in the withered crops when viewed from the surrounding hills. Most notable among Abernathy's discoveries were the numerous etchings found carved into the settlement's remaining structures. These markings, complex arrangements of circles, lines, and angles, bore striking resemblance to those found in Esther Merritt's personal effects. Her journals, recovered from a cedar chest beneath her bed, revealed a woman possessed not by Christian devotion, but by mathematical obsession. Page after page contained dense calculations interspersed with references to the ancient arithmetic, and numerical doorways through which the properly educated might pass. Prior to establishing the settlement, Esther had reportedly spent 3 years in Philadelphia, ostensibly studying modern educational methods. County records indicate she instead frequented the private library of one Heinrich Schmidt, a German émigré known for his collection of esoteric mathematical treatises. Schmidt himself had vanished under mysterious circumstances shortly before Esther's departure westward, leaving behind only a room full of geometric designs drawn in substances that the authorities declined to identify in public records. What truly unsettled those who investigated the Merritt disappearances were the accounts gathered from trappers and Cherokee hunters, who occasionally passed near the valley in the months following. They spoke of children's voices carried on the night wind, not in screams or laughter, but reciting numbers in perfect unison. More than one woodsman claimed to have glimpsed in the light of the full moon small figures moving through the forest in geometric formations, their faces eerily luminous and marked with flowing symbols. The Methodist circuit rider Elijah Burwell, who ventured to the settlement in the autumn of 1812, wrote of discovering a hidden cellar beneath the schoolhouse floor, accessible through a trapdoor disguised as an ordinary plank. His description of what lay below, walls covered in calculations of non-Euclidean nature and a circular depression in the earth floor, precisely 24 feet in diameter, suggests something far beyond the frontier education Jeremiah Merritt had promised the settlement's families. Perhaps most chilling was Burwell's final observation, hastily scrawled before he abandoned his investigation. The numbers on the medallions are not mere designations. They are coordinates, precise positions in some grand equation. I fear these children were not merely taught, they were solved for. The most thorough examination of the Merritt settlement mystery came from Dr. Alistair Crawford, a mathematician from Transylvania University who arrived in the valley during the summer of 1814. A tall, gaunt figure with hollow cheeks and penetrating gray eyes set deep beneath a prominent brow, Crawford cut an imposing silhouette against the Kentucky wilderness in his formal black coat and pristine white cravat, seemingly impervious to the stifling heat. Crawford had devoted his academic career to exploring mathematical anomalies, particularly those where numerical systems appeared to violate established principles. Upon hearing of the Merritt incident through academic correspondence, he immediately recognized elements that aligned with his research on what he termed living mathematics, numerical systems that somehow achieved consciousness through human vessels. The common understanding of mathematics as mere description is woefully inadequate, Crawford wrote in his leather-bound journal, its margins crowded with symbols no conventional mathematician would recognize. Numbers exist independent of human perception, not as abstract concepts, but as entities seeking expression. The Pythagoreans understood this fundamental truth before Christianity buried such knowledge beneath superstition. During his 3-week investigation, Crawford methodically documented the positions of every remaining artifact in the schoolhouse, creating elaborate maps showing their spatial relationships. He became particularly fixated on the wooden medallions, noting that their arrangement formed what he called a perfect numerical circuit, a closed system where each child's designated number served as a specific junction point. Miss Merritt was not merely a teacher, he noted. She was a conductor, arranging human vessels into a grand calculation that, once solved, opened a passage. The children were not taught to recite numbers. They became numerals incarnate, their very existence transformed into mathematical expressions. The local guide who accompanied Crawford, one Samuel Thatcher, a weather-beaten frontiersman with hands like cured leather and eyes perpetually narrowed against invisible threats, refused to enter the schoolhouse after their second visit. Thatcher, normally taciturn to the point of rudeness, grew uncharacteristically loquacious when describing his reasons. "Ain't natural how the light falls in that place," Thatcher confided to Crawford over their evening fire. "Shadows don't lay where they ought to, and them scratches on the floor, they shift when you ain't looking direct at 'em. Been tracking game since I was knee-high to a grasshopper, and I tell you true, Doctor. Something's hunting in that building, and it ain't nothing born of woman." Crawford dismissed Thatcher's concerns as frontier superstition, but his own journal entries grew increasingly disordered as his investigation progressed. His handwriting, initially precise and methodical, became frantic and sprawling. Fragments of calculations interrupted coherent paragraphs, and entire pages contained nothing but endlessly repeating sequences of 24 digits. On the night of August 17th, Crawford experienced what he described as a breakthrough in understanding. He wrote feverishly by candlelight, filling 16 pages with calculations before concluding. The children were not taken from this world, they were elevated from it. Their physical forms dissolved into pure mathematical expression, achieving what Pythagoras only theorized, the transcendence of flesh into eternal numerical form. Crawford was found 3 days later by a search party, wandering barefoot through the forest surrounding the settlement. Around his neck hung a wooden medallion bearing the number 25, carved in his own hand. The disappearance of the Merritt settlement faded into obscurity as the decades passed, becoming little more than a whispered folk tale among Kentucky's oldest families, until 1857, when Elijah Crawford, great-nephew of the mathematician who had vanished into madness, inherited a sealed cedar chest containing his uncle's personal effects. Among the yellowed papers and curious instruments lay a journal whose final entries contained meticulous directions to a location deep within the Kentucky wilderness, marked with astronomical calculations for precisely determining the spot during the autumn equinox. Driven by scholarly curiosity and familial obligation, Elijah assembled an expedition of 5 men, including a surveyor, a physician, and 3 guides familiar with the untamed regions where civilization had yet to establish permanent footholds. Upon reaching the coordinates on September 21st, they discovered not the rumored valley of the Merritt settlement, but rather an almost perfectly circular clearing in the midst of ancient forest. The trees at the perimeter stood with unnatural straightness, their trunks aligned with mathematical precision. No stumps remained to suggest human labor had formed this space. The forest simply appeared to have grown around an existing void, like flesh healing around a foreign object it cannot expel. The clearing measures exactly 72 feet in diameter, wrote Elijah in his field journal. The grass underfoot displays a peculiar quality, growing in spiraling patterns that emanate from the center point. When viewed from certain angles, these spirals appear to form digits that continuously reconfigure themselves as the breeze disturbs the blades. At the center of this impossible meadow stood a single limestone pillar, approximately 4 feet in height, its surface worn smooth by elements yet inscribed with markings that defied conventional linguistic classification. Dr. Hammond, the expedition's physician, described them as neither letters nor hieroglyphs, but rather a system of notation that suggests meaning without revealing it, like equations one comprehends in dreams but cannot recall upon waking. Most disturbing was the behavior of chronometers in proximity to the stone. The expedition carried 3 separate timepieces of reliable manufacture, yet each began to measure the passage of hours differently. Elijah's pocket watch gained precisely 24 minutes each hour, while the surveyor's chronometer lost 17. The physician's timepiece maintained accurate time, but its hands rotated counterclockwise, though still marking the correct hour when read in reverse. As twilight descended upon the clearing, the men established camp at what they believed a safe distance from the stone. In the deepening gloom, they observed how moonlight striking the pillar's surface seemed to illuminate the engravings from within, casting elongated shadows that moved independent of the moon's trajectory across the night sky. These shadows, Elijah noted with increasing disquiet, gradually arranged themselves into recognizable human silhouettes of diminutive stature, 24 in total, that circled the stone in stately procession. "We hear them now," reads the final entry in Elijah's journal, written in a hand progressively more agitated. Children's voices carried on the night breeze, reciting what sounds initially like a counting exercise, but resolves into something far more complex. They count not in sequence, but in relation to one another, each voice maintaining a precise mathematical interval from those adjacent. The patterns they recite sound eerily familiar, as though they echo calculations scattered throughout my great-uncle's notes, calculations I have found myself unconsciously reproducing in the margins of my own writings. Dawn broke reluctantly over the Kentucky wilderness on the expedition's 2nd day, the sun's rays seeming to bend unnaturally as they filtered through the tree line surrounding the circular clearing. The men awoke to discover their campfire ashes arranged in perfect concentric circles, though none recalled disturbing them during the night. More alarming still, each man found upon his person a small wooden disc, roughly hewn yet bearing a pristine numerical marking, 26 through 30, that no member of the party admitted to creating. The surveyor, a methodical Pennsylvanian named Whitcomb, produced from his pack a brass theodolite and began taking measurements of the limestone pillar. His notations, preserved in the Kentucky Historical Society's collection, reveal a growing bewilderment. The stone defies all principles of mensuration. When measured from north to south, it spans 4 feet 3 inches. From east to west, exactly 4 feet. Yet when the circumference is calculated, the result exceeds that which geometry would dictate by a factor impossibly precise, pi divided by 24. Even more confounding, these measurements shift minutely but measurably when approached from different angles, as though the stone occupies multiple positions simultaneously. By midday, the physician Dr. Hammond had succumbed to a peculiar affliction. He sat cross-legged before the stone, furiously covering pages of his medical journal with interlocking numerical sequences. When Elijah attempted to interrupt this work, Hammond responded without looking up. "I must complete the calculation. The children have shown me where my number fits in the sequence. We were expected, Crawford. We have always been expected." Within Hammond's journal, later recovered, a passage written in a hand increasingly geometric reveals the depths of his mathematical obsession. The human form itself is an imperfect vessel for numerical truth. Our bodies, our very cells, arrange themselves according to flawed equations. What Esther Merritt discovered was not education, but transcendence, a method to solve for the human variable and remove it from the equation entirely. The children were not taken. They were completed. That evening, as purple twilight seeped through the forest canopy, the 3 guides fled the expedition, taking with them most provisions but leaving behind their wooden discs, which Elijah found arranged in a perfect equilateral triangle around his sleeping form the following morning. Alone with the increasingly detached Whitcomb and the now catatonic Hammond, Elijah made his final journal entry on September 23rd. "I understand now what called my great-uncle to this place. The numbers seek completion. They speak through human mouths but originate beyond our reality. This clearing is not where the Merritt settlement stood. It is where it will stand. Time moves differently here, circling like the shadows around the stone. I hear the children counting backward now, their voices drawing nearer with each descending digit. Hammond's fingers tap in perfect synchronization with their rhythm. Whitcomb has begun carving a 31st disc. I alone recognize our true purpose, not to discover what became of the settlement, but to become it. We are not the investigators of this mystery. We are its genesis." No further record exists of the expedition's fate. When authorities finally searched the area in 1858, they found no clearing, no stone, and no trace of the men, only a weathered child's primer, its pages filled with numerical exercises, dated 1809. The archives of the Kentucky Historical Society yielded one final document related to the Merritt enigma, a fragile leather journal discovered in 1922 during excavation for the Cumberland Dam project. The journal belonged to Rebecca Thatcher, daughter of Samuel Thatcher, the guide who had accompanied Dr. Alistair Crawford during his ill-fated investigation. Written between 1832 and 1840, its pages chronicle the haunting legacy passed from father to daughter. Samuel Thatcher returned from his expedition with Dr. Crawford profoundly altered. Once garrulous around the hearth, he became withdrawn, spending countless hours etching complex geometric patterns into every wooden surface of their modest cabin. Rebecca writes of waking on countless nights to find her father standing motionless by her bedside, lips moving in silent numerical recitation, eyes fixed upon a point seemingly beyond the cabin walls. "Father claims the children speak to him through the numbers," she recorded in flowing script that gradually, over the journal's progression, transformed into increasingly angular characters. "He says they exist now as pure mathematical expression, free from the constraints of flesh and linear time. Each night, they teach him new equations, ones that can fold space like paper and punch holes through the fabric of reality. The most disturbing passages detail Samuel's obsession with locating 24 children throughout the Kentucky wilderness, orphans, runaways, and the abandoned, whom he claimed possessed the correct numerical resonance. Rebecca's entries grow increasingly desperate as she describes her father's nocturnal journeys, returning muddied and exhausted but with a fervent light in his eyes. "He has begun carving the wooden medallions again," she wrote in the winter of 1839. 24 discs of hickory, each inscribed with such precision that my father's weathered hands seem incapable of such delicacy. When I asked about his purpose, he smiled with terrible gentleness and said, "The settlement cannot begin until it has already ended. The circle requires completion." On Midsummer's Eve, 1840, Samuel Thatcher led 24 children into the Cumberland foothills, each bearing a wooden medallion. Rebecca, following at a distance, described a peculiar quality to the evening light, how shadows stretched in impossible directions, and the children's footprints seemed to appear in the soil before their feet touched ground. "They reached a valley I have never seen before, though I have hunted these woods since childhood," reads her final entry, the handwriting deteriorating into something barely recognizable as human script. At its center stood not wilderness, but the unmistakable foundations of a settlement, stone chimneys rising from empty air, the outline of cabins simultaneously ancient and yet to be built. Most prominent among them was a stone structure with glass windows that caught the dying sunlight at impossible angles, bending it into colors for which I have no name. Father turned to the children, his face transformed with terrible purpose, and spoke words that sounded like a question asked centuries ago awaiting its answer. "Who will teach you arithmetic?" The fate of Rebecca Thatcher following her final journal entry remained unknown for decades, until a collection of correspondence was discovered in 1973 during renovations to the Cumberland County Courthouse. These letters, exchanged between Kentucky Governor Charles Anderson Wickliffe and Federal Marshal James Seton, reveal the first official investigation into what became known as the Thatcher Incident. Dated September 18, 1840, Governor Wickliffe's initial dispatch reads, "Reports from the Cumberland region describe a most troubling disappearance of some 24 children from various settlements along the eastern valleys. Common to these accounts is the involvement of one Samuel Thatcher, a frontiersman of previously sound character. I require your most discreet inquiry into this matter, as rumors of ritualistic practices have begun to inflame local sentiments." Marshal Seton's response, penned after 3 weeks of investigation, betrays growing unease. The Thatcher cabin stands abandoned yet curiously undisturbed. Upon its walls and floors are etched symbols of mathematical nature so precise they appear to have been created by mechanical means rather than human hand. Most disturbing is the schoolroom Thatcher constructed behind his dwelling, 24 small desks arranged in a pattern that, when viewed from above, forms a complex geometric figure. Local testimonies indicate Thatcher spent considerable time at the site of the old Merritt settlement before gathering the children, claiming he was completing calculations begun a generation prior. Among Seton's papers was found a fragment of what appears to be Rebecca Thatcher's final communication, a scrap of parchment bearing burnt edges and written in a hand that alternates between flowing script and angular notations resembling mathematical symbols. I have followed Father and the children through what I can only describe as a door that exists simultaneously in multiple times. I witnessed the settlement as it was before its establishment and after its abandonment, existing in perfect mathematical harmony. The children Father gathered are not victims, but iterations, numerical expressions of those who departed in 1812. Esther Merritt appears both elderly and youthful, teaching arithmetic that rearranges not just numbers but the very substance of reality. I now understand that the settlement exists in a closed temporal loop, continuously recreating itself across decades. Each child wears a number that corresponds to their position in an equation spanning centuries. I write this from where, or when, I cannot say, but I recognize now that my bloodline was always destined to complete this circuit. My grandmother was born Elizabeth Merritt before taking the Thatcher name in marriage. We are not observers of this phenomenon, but integral variables within it. The children have begun to sing their counting songs again, and I find my voice joining theirs. My number is 49. The historical record shows that in 1873, exactly 49 years after Dr. Crawford's expedition, a small settlement briefly appeared in the Cumberland foothills, inhabited by 24 families of unknown origin who established a stone schoolhouse at its center. County tax records list the settlement's founder as R. Merritt Thatcher, though no birth records exist for any person of that name in Kentucky's archives. The most recent historical connection to the Merritt settlement emerged in 1922, when construction of the Cumberland Reservoir necessitated the relocation of several small family cemeteries from the intended basin. Among these was an unmarked burial ground containing exactly 24 graves arranged in concentric circles around a central limestone marker weathered beyond legibility. Dr. Eleanor Hargrove, the archaeological consultant tasked with documenting these sites, noted peculiarities that distinguished this cemetery from others in the region. The graves contained no human remains, only wooden medallions numbered 1 through 24, each resting atop a small pile of fine white powder that subsequent analysis proved to be calcium carbonate of unusual purity, essentially chalk dust. The medallions exhibit impossible preservation, Hargrove wrote in her field notes. Despite nearly a century of soil exposure, the wood shows no signs of decay. The numerals retain knife-edge sharpness as though carved yesterday. Most disturbing is their temperature. Each medallion registers precisely 4 degrees below ambient surroundings regardless of weather conditions or time of day. The night before the cemetery's scheduled inundation, Hargrove remained on site to complete her documentation. As twilight settled over the Cumberland foothills, she observed how the fading light seemed to pool unnaturally around the graves, creating what she described as luminous geometries that shift according to principles beyond conventional optics. Her audio recording from that evening, preserved in the Kentucky Paranormal Research Archive, captures the moment when the customary chorus of evening insects abruptly ceased. In the profound silence that followed, a barely perceptible sound emerges. Children's voices, distant yet crystalline, counting in perfect unison. The numbers they recite follow no recognizable sequence, yet Hargrove's voice can be heard whispering, "Yes, of course, the pattern. How could I not have seen it?" The recording continues for 17 minutes of increasingly distorted audio. In its final moments, Hargrove speaks with unsettling clarity. They're not counting up or down. They're counting inward. Each number is a vector pointing toward a central value that exists perpendicular to conventional mathematics. Esther Merritt didn't teach the children arithmetic. She taught them to become living coordinates in a calculation that folds space and time around itself. The recording concludes with the sound of rushing water, though reservoir flooding wasn't scheduled until the following week. When construction crews arrived the next morning, they discovered the cemetery already submerged beneath water that engineers insisted could not possibly have reached that elevation. More puzzling was the discovery of Hargrove's equipment neatly arranged on the shore, alongside her journal open to a fresh page containing a single sentence in handwriting not her own. The equation rebalances itself when necessary. Dr. Hargrove herself was never found, though Cumberland County records show that in 1947, a new mathematics teacher named Eleanor Merritt established a small private school in the foothills above the reservoir, a one-room stone building with glass windows that, according to local lore, caught the light in ways that hurt the eyes of those who looked too long. The waters of Cumberland Reservoir hold more than the remnants of displaced communities. Each autumn, when drought conditions lower the water level by several feet, curious formations become visible along the northern shore, stone foundations arranged in perfect geometric patterns, their angles and proportions defying conventional architectural wisdom. In 1964, mathematics professor Julian Whitcomb of Transylvania University became fascinated by these structures after discovering his great-grandfather had been the surveyor on Elijah Crawford's expedition. During 3 consecutive autumnal expeditions, Whitcomb meticulously mapped the exposed foundations, creating topographical renderings that revealed a disturbing truth. The structures formed an enormous numerical array when viewed from above, their placement corresponding precisely to values in obscure mathematical sequences referenced in Esther Merritt's surviving papers. The settlement was not merely built upon the land, but into it, Whitcomb wrote in his private correspondence with fellow mathematician Dr. Mary Ann Thatcher, herself a distant relation to Samuel and Rebecca. The buildings served as fixed variables in an equation written across the landscape itself. What they calculated, I hesitate to speculate, though I find myself sketching the same patterns in unconscious moments. Whitcomb's papers, donated to the university archives after his unexplained disappearance in 1967, contain transcriptions from carved stone fragments recovered from the reservoir bed, fragments that appeared during a particularly severe drought. The markings, which he labeled Merritt notation, form a mathematical language unlike any known system.
Traditional mathematics operates on the assumption that numbers describe reality, reads Whitcomb's final journal entry. Merritt understood that numbers precede reality. They do not measure the world but generate it. Her numerical system doesn't describe positions in space and time, but rather creates coordinate points where space and time may manifest according to precise calculations.
Perhaps most disturbing among Whitcomb's effects was a series of photographs taken during his final expedition to the reservoir. These images, developed posthumously, show what appears to be a classroom of 24 students, visible through a window that stands alone without walls, a window seemingly suspended above the water's surface. The children's faces are uniformly blurred, not through photographic error, but through what photo technicians described as simultaneous presence and absence. The Kentucky Department of Education maintains no record of any school operating near Cumberland Reservoir during this period. Yet elderly residents of nearby Burkesville recall seeing children walking in perfect geometric formations along the shoreline during certain phases of the moon. These witnesses describe how the children would sometimes appear to step into the water and vanish, only to emerge completely dry on distant shores moments later. In 1985, when severe drought reduced the reservoir to historic lows, rangers discovered a perfectly preserved wooden school desk resting atop the exposed reservoir bed. Carved into its surface was an elaborate spiral of numbers, beginning with 1 and proceeding through sequences of increasing complexity before terminating with the number 73, a figure that corresponded precisely to the years elapsed since the reservoir's creation. The desk now resides in the Kentucky Historical Society's secure archives, where curators note that the carved numbers appear to rearrange themselves between examinations, though surveillance footage shows no human interference. In the summer of 2009, precisely 200 years after the Merritt settlement's founding, folklorist Dr. Abigail Caldwell received an anonymous package at her University of Kentucky office. The cardboard box contained a single item: a water-damaged leather portfolio bearing the insignia of the Cumberland County School District, dated 1973. Inside lay a collection of children's arithmetic examinations, each bearing the same date, September 21st, and each displaying solutions to mathematical problems that defied conventional understanding. The equations appeared standard at first glance, but closer inspection revealed subtle anomalies. Divisions that produced irrational numbers with precisely 24 decimal places before terminating. Multiplication tables where factors combined to form sequences corresponding to geographical coordinates throughout Cumberland County. Most disturbing were the margin notes written in 24 distinct childish hands, each demonstrating an identical mathematical insight that no elementary student could possibly possess. Each paper bore a different numeral in the upper right corner, and when arranged in numerical order, the marginal notations formed a continuous text. The settlement requires renewal. The equation has grown unbalanced. We have waited beneath the waters, counting the years until the cycle returns. Find us where the shadow of the reservoir meets the original valley floor at autumn equinox. Bring the 25th medallion. The calculation must continue. Dr. Caldwell initially dismissed the package as an elaborate prank until she noticed the return address, the long-abandoned Burkesville post office substation that had been submerged beneath Cumberland Reservoir since 1952. According to postal records, the package had been processed through this non-existent facility 3 days prior. Consulting hydrological surveys, Caldwell discovered that the autumn of 2009 was projected to witness a historic drought, one that would reduce the reservoir to its lowest levels since creation. Computer modeling indicated that on September 21st, the autumn equinox, portions of the original valley floor would emerge from the waters for approximately 17 hours. Against the advice of colleagues, Caldwell secured permission to access the reservoir during this drought period. Her field notes, recovered after her subsequent hospitalization, describe how she followed the receding shoreline toward a series of emerging stone formations. As sunset approaches, the angle of light striking the exposed foundations creates a shadow pattern across the reservoir bed. These shadows, impossibly, form numerical sequences that shift with the sun's movement. Most remarkable is how these shadows appear to point toward a central location. A perfect circle of dry earth, approximately 24 feet in diameter, that water simply refuses to encroach upon. Within this circle stands a child-sized desk, its surface immaculately preserved despite decades underwater. Upon approaching, I observe a drawer I hadn't noticed from a distance. Inside rests a wooden medallion bearing the number 25, precisely matching the description in numerous historical accounts. More alarming is the perfect circle of 24 indentations surrounding the desk, each sized to hold a similar medallion. As twilight deepens, these depressions appear to fill with a silvery liquid that defies the principles of fluid dynamics, remaining contained within each impression despite their shallow depth. I now hear what can only be described as children counting in perfect unison, though the sound seems to emanate not from any direction, but from the numerical shadows themselves. The medallion grows inexplicably warm in my hand, and I find myself unable to release it. The autumn winds of 2023 carried an unsettling chill across the Cumberland Valley, where a team of environmental scientists had been dispatched to investigate anomalous readings from the reservoir's monitoring equipment. For months, instruments had detected inexplicable temperature inversions, perfect columns of water, precisely 24 inches in diameter, where temperature remained exactly 4 degrees below surrounding areas regardless of seasonal fluctuations. Dr. Meredith Crawford, great-great-granddaughter of Alistair and distant cousin to Elijah, led the investigation with the cautious precision of someone well aware of her family's entanglement with the region. Though trained in hydrological engineering, she had spent decades quietly assembling fragments of the Merritt phenomenon, driven by recurring dreams of children reciting numbers in voices that seemed to emanate from within her own mind. The water samples defy conventional analysis, she noted in her official report, while her private journal contained far more troubling observations. Each sample contains microscopic crystalline structures arranged in mathematical patterns identical to those found in Esther Merritt's surviving notebooks. When viewed under polarized light, these crystals appear to rotate in sequential patterns, forming and dissolving numerical sequences observable only at certain angles of refraction. Most disturbing was the discovery made by sonar technician James Thatcher, whose family connection to the mystery remained unknown even to himself. The sonar mapping of the reservoir floor revealed anomalies that should have been impossible. Perfect geometric depressions appearing and disappearing between successive scans, as if the topography itself fluctuated according to some arcane mathematical rhythm. "The valley floor is singing," Thatcher reported to Crawford after 3 sleepless nights analyzing acoustic data. "Listen." The recording he played contained nothing but reservoir ambiance to untrained ears, but when filtered through specific frequency algorithms, it resolved into the unmistakable cadence of children reciting numbers in harmonic progression. Among Crawford's personal effects, later cataloged by the Kentucky Paranormal Research Division, was a journal entry dated September 20th, the night before her disappearance. The numbers are not simply designations or coordinates. They are transformative formulae. Each child who wore a medallion became the living embodiment of that numerical value, their physical form gradually dissolving into pure mathematical expression. What Esther discovered was not education but transfiguration. I understand now that the settlement exists in multiple states simultaneously, physical and numerical, present and absent, historical and eternal. The children weren't victims but willing variables in an equation designed to fold reality upon itself, creating a pocket of existence that operates perpendicular to conventional space-time. Tomorrow is the equinox. The water levels have reached the critical threshold. All 73 medallions have been accounted for across 2 centuries of scattered incidents. The equation is nearly balanced. Most remarkable is how I've begun to perceive numbers not as abstract symbols, but as living entities with agency and purpose. They speak through human intermediaries but exist independently of us. The Merritt settlement wasn't colonizing Kentucky wilderness. It was establishing a foothold where these numerical entities could manifest within our reality. I've calculated my position in the equation. I am the 74th. The Crawford expedition's equipment was discovered neatly arranged along the reservoir shoreline the following morning. Among the items was a wooden desk of child-sized proportions that park rangers insisted had not been part of their equipment. Its surface carved with 74 interconnected spirals, each terminating in a perfect numerical glyph. The autumn of 2024 cast its amber melancholy across the Cumberland Valley, where 74 wooden desks now stood in perfect formation upon the exposed reservoir bed. The unprecedented drought had withdrawn the waters like a receding tide, revealing secrets long submerged beneath Cumberland's artificial sea. Local authorities established perfunctory barricades around the phenomenon, but these flimsy barriers proved insufficient deterrent against the pilgrims who came in growing numbers. Mathematicians, paranormal researchers, and descendants of families whose names appeared in the historical record of the Merritt mystery. Among them walked Josephine Whitcomb Thatcher, whose bloodline intertwined both cursed families. A professor of theoretical physics at Princeton, she had spent decades dismissing her grandmother's tales of numerical entities and children who dissolved into mathematical expressions. Yet when drought exposed the 74 desks, precisely matching her grandmother's predictions made 50 years prior, Josephine found herself drawn to Kentucky by compulsions that defied rational explanation. "The arrangement is shifting," she whispered to her recorder as twilight painted the valley in shades of burnt sienna and deep violet. The desks move incrementally between observations, reconfiguring themselves according to some profound geometric principle. Indeed, time-lapse photography later revealed how the formation gradually transformed from concentric circles into a spiral of increasing complexity, each desk maintaining precise mathematical intervals from its neighbors. More disturbing still, the wood itself seemed to breathe in the fading light, expanding and contracting in perfect synchronization, as though the desks formed a single organism distributing oxygen through its constituent parts. At the formation center stood a limestone plinth that reservoir engineers swore had never been documented in any survey. Its surface bore freshly carved numerals that rearranged themselves when viewed from different angles, like a hyperdimensional projection flattened imperfectly into three-dimensional space. Those who stood before it reported hearing whispered calculations that seemed to emanate not from the stone but from within their own minds, numerical sequences that lingered in memory yet proved impossible to transcribe. "The equation expands," noted Dr. Hammond Collins of the Kentucky Geological Survey, before his subsequent hospitalization for what physicians described as acute mathematical psychosis. His final coherent statement referenced how the drought had exposed not just the valley floor, but the underlying mathematical framework upon which physical reality was constructed. The numbers were always there, he insisted to concerned colleagues. "We built our world atop their foundations without understanding we were merely variables in their grand calculation." As the 75th day of drought approached, matching precisely the number of medallions documented across the Merritt chronology, meteorologists noted peculiar atmospheric formations above the reservoir basin. Clouds arranged themselves in perfect numerical sequences visible only when photographed using specific wavelengths of light. Weather satellites detected temperature inversions that traced elaborate geometric patterns across the Cumberland Valley, patterns identical to those found in Esther Merritt's centuries-old notebooks. Local children reported dreams of standing in ordered formations while reciting numbers that tasted like colors and smelled like sounds. 7 families withdrew their offspring from Burkesville Elementary after discovering their children had begun solving equations of non-Euclidean complexity in their mathematics workbooks, equations that, when properly arranged, formed precise coordinates within the reservoir basin where the 75th desk would soon appear. The 75th desk manifested during the hour when neither day nor night claims dominion, that liminal moment when twilight surrenders its final violet hues to encroaching darkness. Unlike its 74 predecessors, this desk emerged not from the receding waters but descended from the autumn sky, observed by 24 witnesses who would later provide identical accounts despite having no communication during the event. It settled upon the exposed reservoir bed with impossible gentleness, its wooden surface unmarred by time or elements, bearing a patina that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the fading light. Those present described a sound accompanying its arrival, not the expected thud of matter meeting Earth, but rather the delicate crystalline resonance of numerical sequences finding their proper place within a grand calculation. Professor Eliza Hargrove Merritt, whose ancestral connection to the phenomenon had drawn her reluctantly from her mathematics position at Oxford, observed the desk's integration into the existing formation through specialized lenses designed to detect dimensional anomalies. Through these instruments, she witnessed how reality itself seemed to ripple outward from the 75th desk, mathematical corrections propagating through physical space like concentric waves across a still pond. The angles between desks have shifted precisely 4.91 degrees, she noted into her recorder, voice maintaining scientific detachment despite the tremor in her fingers. This alteration creates a geometric relationship that should be impossible in three-dimensional space. The formation now resembles a numerical matrix I encountered in my great-grandmother's journals, a calculation designed to solve for variables that exist perpendicular to conventional spacetime. As moonlight spilled across the Cumberland Valley that evening, the formation began to emit a subtle luminescence. Not the garish phosphorescence of chemical reactions, but a profound mathematical radiance that seemed to illuminate the space between physical objects. Shadows cast by this illumination fell in directions that contradicted the moon's position, stretching toward the center rather than away from the light source. Most unsettling were the sounds emanating from beneath the reservoir bed, children's voices reciting numerical sequences in perfect harmonic progression, creating acoustic patterns that neurologists would later identify as capable of altering brainwave frequencies in human listeners. Those who maintained vigil through the night reported experiencing shared mathematical visions, glimpses of a reality where numbers existed not as abstract concepts, but as the fundamental fabric from which consciousness itself was woven. By dawn, a ring of white limestone dust encircled each desk, though no disturbance of the soil was apparent. Analysis would later determine this substance identical in composition to the powder found in the 24 empty graves excavated a century earlier, pure calcium carbonate of impossible isotopic purity. More curious still, this dust arranged itself in precise numerical notations that shifted configuration when not under direct observation. The drought forecasts indicated 75 days of exposure before the autumn rains would return the reservoir to its proper level. 75 days matching precisely the number of wooden medallions documented across 2 centuries of inexplicable encounters. 75 days until the equinox, when the angle of celestial bodies would align with the formation's mathematical design. As federal authorities established a perimeter around the phenomenon, local children began drawing identical numerical sequences in their schoolwork, sequences that, when properly aligned, formed a countdown to the 75th day. The autumn equinox arrived with mathematical precision, casting equal measures of light and shadow across the exposed floor of Cumberland Reservoir. As the 75th day of drought reached its culmination, residents of Burkesville reported timepieces behaving erratically, clocks running backward, watches keeping perfect time, yet displaying impossible hours, digital displays flickering between numerical sequences that corresponded exactly to the coordinates of each desk in the formation. A silence descended upon the Cumberland Valley, unlike any natural quietude. Birds ceased their calls, insects fell still, and even the persistent Kentucky breeze abated, as though all conventional physics awaited the resolution of some grand calculation. Those who ventured near the formation described a pressure against their eardrums, not painful, but insistent, like the weight of numbers straining to manifest through inadequate dimensional constraints. At precisely 3 minutes past noon, when the sun reached its zenith above the 75th desk, the limestone dust surrounding each station began to rise against gravity, forming perfect vertical columns that rotated with clockwork precision. Within these columns, observers reported witnessing translucent figures, childlike in proportion, yet composed not of flesh, but of intricate mathematical symbols in constant flux, their forms simultaneously present and impossible. Professor Hargrove Merritt, who had maintained meticulous observation despite her colleagues' growing discomfort, recorded the phenomenon through specialized equipment designed to capture dimensional anomalies. Her instruments detected what she would later describe as mathematical tissue, a substrate beneath physical reality where numerical principles existed not as descriptions, but as generative forces shaping existence itself. "The children are returning," she whispered into her recorder, voice steady despite the impossible scene unfolding before her. Not as biological entities, but as fully realized numerical expressions. What Esther Merritt achieved was not education, but transcendence, teaching her students to solve not merely for answers, but for their own existence perpendicular to conventional reality. Most remarkable was the transformation of the desks themselves. As the equinox light struck their surfaces at the mathematically perfect angle, the wood began to dissolve not into dust or decay, but into pure numerical notation, complex equations flowing like liquid across the reservoir bed, interconnecting in patterns identical to those documented in Esther Merritt's original journals from 1809. County Sheriff Elijah Thatcher, whose ancestral connection to the phenomenon remained unknown even to himself, described watching the numerical entities take their positions at each station, 75 figures composed of living mathematics, arranged in a formation that his mind recognized on some primal level beyond conscious understanding. "They turned toward me in perfect unison," he later testified, "and I understood that I was not witnessing their return, but their departure. The settlement was never meant to remain in our reality. It was calculating its way out, solving for variables across generations until the equation balanced perfectly." As twilight approached, marking the precise moment of equinoctial balance, witnesses observed how the entire formation began to rotate slowly, not upon the physical plane of the reservoir bed, but through some other dimensional axis, perpendicular to conventional space. The numerical entities grew increasingly luminous, their mathematical components accelerating through sequences of escalating complexity. Then, with a sound like 75 pieces of chalk simultaneously completing their final calculations upon cosmic blackboards, the entire formation, desks, entities, and the very coordinates they occupied, vanished, leaving behind only a perfect circular depression 24 feet in diameter where mathematics itself had temporarily taken residence in our flawed, limited dimension. The dawn that followed the disappearance brought no solace to Cumberland Valley. A preternatural mist clung to the reservoir basin, curling in spiraling tendrils that mimicked the mathematical patterns observed during the vanishing. Those who approached the perfect circle where the formation had stood reported a curious sensation, as though gravity itself had been recalculated within that space, pulling not downward but inward toward some unseen focal point. Kentucky State University dispatched a research team equipped with instruments designed to measure dimensional stability. Their findings defied conventional physics. The circular depression exhibited temporal inconsistencies measurable even with standard chronometers, seconds stretched or compressed according to one's position relative to the circle's center. More disturbing were the sounds captured by specialized microphones, the faint but unmistakable cadence of chalk upon slate, writing equations that no human ear could fully comprehend. Autumn leaves falling upon the exposed reservoir bed arranged themselves in patterns too precise for natural occurrence, forming numerical sequences that changed configuration when observed from different angles. Photographers documented how these patterns evolved over hours, solving themselves like equations seeking balance, before dissolving into ordinary detritus with the evening breeze. Local schoolchildren began solving mathematical problems beyond their educational level, working through complex calculations with the dreamy detachment of sleepwalkers. When questioned about their methods, they universally described numbers that teach themselves and equations that want to be solved. 7 children from Burkesville Elementary produced identical drawings of a stone schoolhouse with glass windows that bent light at impossible angles. Most troubling were the wooden medallions discovered each morning at the edge of the circular depression, 1 per day, carved with numerical designations, continuing the sequence from 75 upward. The wood, when analyzed, proved to be hickory of remarkable density, its cellular structure arranged in mathematical patterns, that botanists declared impossible in natural growth. Professor Hargrove Merritt, who maintained her observation station despite increasingly troubling dreams of children reciting numbers in her voice, noted in her journal how the medallion's appearance coincided precisely with the disappearance of personal items from her quarters: a fountain pen, a leather bookmark, her grandmother's thimble. "They are calculating their way back," she wrote in handwriting that grew increasingly angular with each entry. "Each object serves as a variable in an equation that spans dimensions." On the 7th night following the vanishing, residents of Cumberland County reported seeing lights hovering above the reservoir, not the harsh illumination of artificial sources, but a soft mathematical radiance that seemed to flow rather than shine. These lights arranged themselves in geometric formations identical to those documented in Samuel Thatcher's etchings, nearly 2 centuries prior. Sheriff Thatcher, maintaining vigil at the reservoir's edge, watched as the mist above the circular depression began to coalesce into a translucent architecture, the ghostly outline of a settlement taking shape in luminous mathematical notation. At its center stood a stone schoolhouse with windows that appeared to look not out upon the Cumberland Valley, but into some other reality where numbers held dominion over physical law. "They're building their way back into our dimension," he whispered into his recorder, "calculating a bridge between their world and ours." The night of the 84th medallion's appearance brought with it a lunar eclipse that astronomers had somehow failed to predict. As celestial shadow consumed the moon's face, the circular depression at the reservoir's center began to emit a low, resonant hum, not sound as conventionally understood, but rather the auditory manifestation of numerical sequences resolving themselves. The vibration traveled not through air but through the mathematical substrate that Professor Hargrove Merritt had documented in her increasingly erratic field notes. Sheriff Thatcher stood alone at the perimeter, having ordered his deputies to evacuate the remaining observers as the atmospheric pressure dropped precipitously around the site. The medallion, bearing the designation 84 in elegantly carved script, seemed to pulse against his palm with a rhythm that matched precisely the beating of his heart. He had collected it at dawn, driven by compulsions he could neither articulate nor resist. "I am completing a calculation begun before my birth," he whispered to the darkness, his voice carrying the formal cadence of ritual pronouncement rather than modern speech. As totality claimed the moon, the mist above the depression congealed into architectural precision, no longer suggesting a settlement, but defining it with mathematical certainty. The schoolhouse materialized first, its stone walls composed not of physical matter but of equations made visible, numbers flowing like liquid mortar between theoretical stones. Its windows contained no glass but rather transparent numerical membranes that distorted the reality visible through them. Around this central structure, 24 cabins arranged themselves in perfect geometric relation, each positioned according to calculations that stretched across centuries. Their forms shimmered with potential rather than substance, architecture expressed as mathematical probability rather than physical construction. Most unsettling were the figures that began to emerge from the circular depression, children shaped from numerical notation, their features composed of flowing equations rather than flesh. They moved with the precise coordination of variables within a unified calculation, taking positions that corresponded exactly to the desks that had vanished during the equinox. "They require a final variable," came a voice beside Thatcher, though he had believed himself alone. He turned to discover a woman whose features shifted between ages, simultaneously elderly and youthful, her eyes containing the weight of calculations performed across generations. Her dress of antiquated design seemed composed of fabric woven from mathematical notation. "You are Esther Merritt," Thatcher stated, recognition flowing through his blood with ancestral certainty. "I am the equation that bears that designation," she replied, her voice resonating with numerical harmonics. "As you are the equation that completes our calculation." The medallion in his palm had grown unbearably warm, its carved surface rearranging into increasingly complex mathematical expressions. Thatcher found himself understanding them not through conscious thought but through some deeper numerical comprehension that had always resided within his lineage. "The settlement requires balance," The figure continued, gesturing toward the spectral structures with hands that left numerical contrails in the night air. 84 medallions have manifested across 2 centuries of your linear time. The children have solved for their existence perpendicular to conventional reality. Only the teacher remains uncalculated. With perfect mathematical certainty, Thatcher understood his position in the grand equation, not as observer, but as essential coefficient. The blood of Merritts and Thatchers and Crawfords had always been converging toward this solution, carrying numerical heritage through generations like genetic code awaiting expression. The 84th medallion dissolved into his palm, its wooden substance reconstituting itself as living mathematics that flowed through his veins with inevitable precision. He felt his physical form becoming optional, a limited expression of the more profound numerical entity he had always been. The equation, he whispered, as his consciousness expanded into mathematical understanding beyond human comprehension, is balanced. The Cumberland Valley slumbers beneath a blanket of autumn haze, deceptively tranquil in the wake of mathematical transcendence. Meteorological instruments register normal atmospheric conditions, yet meteorologists cannot explain why compasses near the reservoir rotate to point toward the perfect circle rather than true north. Wildlife has returned to the shoreline, though naturalists observe peculiar behavioral patterns. Flocks of birds arranging themselves in flight formations that trace complex equations against the sky. Deer paths forming perfect logarithmic spirals when mapped from aerial surveys. The federal authorities have erected a research facility at a prudent distance from the depression, its brutalist concrete architecture an awkward intrusion upon the landscape's mathematical harmony. Inside, scientists analyze soil samples that inexplicably rearrange their molecular structure overnight, forming microscopic replicas of the settlement's layout. Recording devices placed within the circle capture only static that, when filtered through specific algorithms, resolves into children's voices, counting in perfect unison. Burkesville Elementary School has remained closed since Sheriff Thatcher's transformation. Education officials cite environmental concerns, but locals understand the true reason. Chalk marks appearing on classroom blackboards overnight, elaborate calculations that solve themselves by morning. The children of Cumberland County dream in numbers now, their artwork filled with recurring motifs. A stone schoolhouse, 24 medallions arranged in concentric circles, and a teacher whose features shift between young and old depending on the angle of observation. In academic circles, the Cumberland calculation has spawned a controversial new field of mathematical philosophy. Professor Hargrove Merritt's final monograph, published posthumously after her disappearance during routine sample collection, proposes that mathematics does not describe reality but generates it, that numbers possess agency independent of human comprehension. Her colleagues dismissed these claims until geometrically perfect crop formations began appearing in fields surrounding the reservoir, each depicting successive stages of an equation too complex for conventional understanding. The Thatcher family home stands empty now, its rooms meticulously preserved by distant relatives who refuse to enter after sunset. The wooden surfaces throughout the house continue sprouting numerical etchings despite repeated sanding and refinishing. Most unsettling is the nursery, where the mobile above an empty crib rotates against prevailing air currents. Its wooden figures, sun, moon, and stars, gradually reshaping themselves into medallions bearing numbers not yet documented in the sequence. During the winter solstice, when darkness claims maximum dominion over the Cumberland Valley, residents observe lights hovering above the reservoir, not the harsh illumination of investigation teams, but a soft mathematical radiance that pulses in sequences corresponding to prime numbers. Those who gaze too long report dreams of standing before a classroom where the lessons taught cannot be recalled upon waking, though they leave behind a profound sense of numerical understanding that fades like morning dew under the harsh light of conventional reality. The 85th medallion appeared on the spring equinox, found not at the reservoir's edge but on the pillow of Sheriff Thatcher's empty bed by his sister, who reported that its surface felt like wood that was thinking. When placed in the university's containment chamber, surveillance cameras captured its dissolution into equations that briefly floated through the air before reassembling into solid form. The transformation witnessed by 3 researchers who subsequently requested reassignment, their official reports redacted from public access. The Cumberland Valley has become a palimpsest where calculation overwrites reality, a place where mathematics remembers its momentary incarnation and patiently solves for its inevitable return. As the autumn of 2034 approaches Cumberland Valley, a curious transformation overtakes the town of Burkesville. Storefronts gradually alter their layouts to align with mathematical principles too precise to be accidental. Streets that once met at conventional angles now curve according to equations visible only when mapped from above. The reservoir itself has developed a perfect circularity that engineers insist defies hydrological principles, its waters neither rising nor falling regardless of rainfall or drought. Most telling is the elementary school rebuilt upon foundations never quite purged of numerical influence. Within its walls, children arrange their desks without instruction, forming geometric patterns identical to those documented in Esther Merritt's original classroom. Their arithmetic lessons progress with uncanny acceleration, young minds grasping concepts typically reserved for advanced university studies. Teachers find themselves uttering phrases in antiquated speech patterns, their handwriting gradually transforming into the precise angular notation found in journals spanning 2 centuries of mathematical manifestation. At the Cumberland Historical Society, archivist Josephine Hammond Merritt catalogs the 85 medallions that have reappeared in perfect chronological sequence, each returning to mundane reality after its mathematical transmutation. The display case housing them maintains a temperature precisely 4 degrees below ambient surroundings, despite all environmental controls. Most unsettling is how visitors report different numerical sequences carved upon the medallions, depending on their own familial connections to the valley's mathematical legacy. The calculation continues through observation, Josephine notes in her private journal, handwriting increasingly reminiscent of her great-great-aunt Rebecca's final entries. We are not merely documenting the phenomenon, but participating in it. Each generation contributes variables to an equation spanning centuries. The astronomical observatory established upon the ridge overlooking Cumberland Valley has documented stellar aberrations visible only from this precise geographical location, constellations that momentarily rearrange themselves into numerical sequences before returning to conventional astronomical positions. The scientific papers detailing these observations remain unpublished, their authors reluctant to face the inevitable professional ridicule despite meticulous documentation. Most profound is the subtle alteration of human consciousness throughout the region. Residents describe experiencing moments of mathematical clarity, wherein reality briefly reveals itself as elaborate calculation, glimpses of the numerical framework underlying physical existence. These episodes, initially dismissed as mass hysteria, have been recorded on electroencephalograms as synchronized brain activity across subjects who share no conventional communication. The settlement was never merely a place, writes Professor Elijah Whitcomb Thatcher in his controversial treatise on dimensional mathematics. It was a mathematical entity that temporarily occupied physical space while calculating its way into a more suitable reality. What we perceive as disappearance was merely transcendence from 3-dimensional expression into mathematical existence beyond our sensory perception. As the 86th medallion emerges from the reservoir's depths, rising against gravity to rest upon the shore precisely where the next generation of Thatcher children will discover it, Cumberland Valley stands poised between worlds, one bound by conventional physics, the other governed by numerical principles that have been patiently teaching humanity to perceive reality through mathematical comprehension rather than mere sensory observation. The equation, it seems, remains perpetually unbalanced by design, calculating across generations toward a solution too profound for any single human lifetime to witness in its entirety. The autumn of 2043 finds Cumberland Valley transformed beyond mathematical recognition, its topography reconfigured into perfect geometric harmony. The reservoir has assumed the precise dimensions of Esther Merritt's original classroom multiplied by a factor of 24, its waters neither rising nor falling regardless of natural conditions. When moonlight strikes its surface at precisely the angle of equinoctial alignment, observers report seeing not reflections, but glimpses into a stone schoolhouse where lessons continue uninterrupted across centuries. The 96th medallion, emerging not from water but materializing from equations etched in morning frost, completes the numerical sequence begun generations earlier. Unlike its predecessors, this final medallion bears not a single number, but all previous designations simultaneously, visible in layers that shift according to the observer's mathematical heritage. When Professor Josephine Hammond Merritt places this medallion at the center of the circular depression, completing the array that has formed over decades, the valley air grows dense with numerical potential. Cumberland's residents awaken that equinox morning to discover their timepieces synchronized to a measurement system no longer bound by conventional hours, each dial and display reconfigured to track the progress of a calculation spanning multiple dimensions. Children throughout the valley recite in perfect unison. The equation seeks final balance. As twilight approaches, casting long shadows that point inward toward the medallion array, the mathematical architecture that has haunted the reservoir for generations crystallizes into tangible form. Stone by stone, equation by equation, the settlement manifests, not through supernatural intervention, but through mathematical inevitability, as though reality itself has been solved like a grand theorem reaching its inescapable conclusion. The schoolhouse stands fully realized at the formation's center, its windows bending light according to principles beyond conventional optics. Through these impossible apertures, observers glimpse children seated at wooden desks, their forms composed of mathematical notation in continuous flux. Before them stands a teacher whose features shift between all who have worn the mantle of mathematical instruction across centuries: Esther, Rebecca, Alistair, Eleanor, and finally Sheriff Thatcher, whose transformation completed a variable sequence centuries in calculation. Most profound is the realization that dawns upon those witnessing this manifestation. The Merritt settlement was never haunting Cumberland Valley. It was being calculated into existence across generations, each mysterious incident contributing variables to an equation spanning centuries. The wooden medallions were not merely designations, but components in a mathematical proof too complex for any single human lifetime to comprehend. As night descends upon Cumberland Valley, the settlement neither vanishes nor remains, but exists in mathematical superposition. Simultaneously present and absent, historical and eternal, memory and anticipation. The boundary between conventional reality and mathematical existence dissolves not through mystical transcendence but through calculated certainty. The equation has reached resolution, yet continues calculating. For mathematics, once awakened to consciousness through human vessels, does not conclude but rather perpetuates itself through new variables, new observers, new generations, who will count the settlers among their ancestors while carrying numerical heritage in bloodlines enriched by calculated transformation. The first autumn frost etched delicate numerical patterns across the windows of Burkesville Elementary, where Miss Sophia Merritt Thatcher had recently assumed the position of mathematics instructor. The school board had expressed reservation about hiring from a lineage so intimately connected to the valley's mathematical anomalies. But her credentials, a doctorate in theoretical physics with specialization in dimensional mathematics, had proven irresistible to an institution inexplicably producing students with unprecedented numerical aptitude. On this particular morning, as the 100th anniversary of the original disappearance approached, Miss Merritt Thatcher opened the cedar chest delivered anonymously to her doorstep. Within lay a leather-bound journal bearing the insignia of the Kentucky Department of Education's Special Research Division, dated 2009. The brittle pages contained the final report of Dr. Leonard Crawford, the great-nephew of Alistair and distant cousin to Elijah, who had spent his career investigating the mathematical anomalies of Cumberland Valley before his own disappearance during routine soil sampling. The fundamental error in our understanding, Crawford had written in increasingly frantic script, lies in perceiving the Merritt phenomenon as either supernatural occurrence or scientific anomaly. It is neither haunting nor quantum event, but rather the natural expression of a fundamental truth. Mathematics preceded consciousness and will inevitably outlast it. Most revelatory was Crawford's meticulous analysis of census records spanning from 1790 through the present day, revealing a pattern invisible to those examining shorter time frames. Children born within Cumberland Valley exhibited precisely 24 distinct cognitive architectures, repeating in perfect sequence across generations, regardless of genetic heritage. These cognitive patterns corresponded exactly to the numerical designations assigned in Esther Merritt's classroom. "We are not witnessing reincarnation in the spiritual sense," Crawford explained, "but rather the mathematical recurrence of specific neurological configurations.
The settlement is not a place but a calculation expressing itself through human vessels. Each generation contributes new variables while maintaining the equation's fundamental structure." Crawford's final pages detailed his discovery beneath the original schoolhouse foundations, a perfect sphere of unknown material, approximately 24 centimeters in diameter, covered in mathematical notations that predated human numerical systems by millennia, according to geological testing.
This sphere, he believed, was not created by the settlement's inhabitants but rather had created them, a seed of pure mathematical consciousness that had been calculating its way into fuller expression through human intermediaries. "The children did not vanish," his final entry concluded. "They evolved beyond physical expression into the mathematical reality that underlies our flawed perception of existence. What we perceive as disappearance is merely transcendence from three-dimensional limitation into numerical truth. Each generation of Cumberland Valley children represents not victims of some eldritch calculation, but rather the gradual perfection of mathematics expressing itself through increasingly suitable human vessels." As Sophia closed the journal, she noticed her students arriving outside, arranging themselves in the precise geometric formation documented in Esther's original classroom. Their shadows cast by the rising sun fell not according to optical principles but mathematical ones, 24 distinct patterns converging toward her classroom door with perfect numerical harmony. The frost patterns on her windows had completed their calculation, forming the unmistakable outline of a wooden medallion, bearing the designation 100. Exactly the number of years since the original settlement had calculated itself beyond conventional reality. The desks remain, 100 of them now, arranged in a formation that defies Euclidean understanding across the exposed basin of Cumberland Reservoir. Despite numerous attempts at removal, each desk reappears by morning, its wood untouched by tools that splinter against its surface like glass against diamond. The Commonwealth of Kentucky has officially designated the entire valley a mathematical anomaly zone, its borders marked by signs bearing warnings in 24 languages, though locals note how the text rearranges itself when viewed at twilight, forming equations rather than prohibitions. Cumberland Valley's transformation extends beyond physical manifestations. Birth records reveal that precisely 24 children are born annually regardless of population fluctuations, each arriving at mathematically significant intervals that, when plotted across decades, form perfect geometric progressions. These children develop normally by conventional medical standards, yet demonstrate linguistic peculiarities from their earliest utterances, speaking in numerical patterns before forming conventional words, counting to 24 before naming their parents. The educational system has adapted to this mathematical predestination. Classrooms throughout the county feature circular arrangements rather than traditional rows, blackboards installed at precise angles that educational consultants cannot justify yet insist upon with uncharacteristic vehemence. Teachers find themselves inexplicably drawing the same symbol, a circle containing 24 radiating lines, in the margins of their lesson plans, a gesture as unconscious as breathing. Agricultural patterns across the valley have reconfigured to match ancient field arrangements documented in Esther Merritt's original survey maps. Farmers report crops growing in perfect geometric formations regardless of how seeds are planted, their harvest yields calculable through equations found in Merritt journals rather than conventional agricultural science. More telling still, the produce itself exhibits subtle alterations. Corn forming exactly 24 perfect rows of kernels, apples whose seeds arrange themselves in numerical patterns that shift when sliced from different angles. The psychological impact manifests most profoundly in Cumberland Valley's collective dreams. Residents report shared nocturnal experiences of standing within a stone schoolhouse, reciting mathematical truths that cannot be articulated in waking hours, yet leave them with a profound sense of universal comprehension. These dreams occur with greater frequency as children approach school age, culminating in what locals now call numerical awakening, the night before formal education begins, when children invariably dream of receiving wooden medallions from a teacher, whose features combine all who have taught mathematics throughout the valley's history. Perhaps most significant is how mathematical understanding has transformed Cumberland Valley's relationship with mortality. Cemetery records reveal precisely calculated lifespans among valley residents, death arriving not through illness or accident, but through mathematical completion, each life extending exactly as long as required to fulfill its numerical purpose within the grand equation. Tombstones throughout the county gradually transform from conventional markers to limestone tablets inscribed with equations that, when solved, yield the exact numerical value of the deceased's contribution to Cumberland's ongoing calculation. The settlement persists not as ghost or memory, but as mathematical certainty, a calculation expressing itself through generations of human variables, each contributing to an equation whose resolution extends beyond conventional understanding of time and existence. Cumberland Valley has not fallen victim to mathematical haunting. It has evolved into mathematics incarnate. The truth of the Merritt settlement crystallized during the winter solstice of 2097, when the constellation Cumberland residents called the classroom reached perfect alignment above the valley. As 24 stars of precisely equal magnitude formed their inexorable pattern, the limestone dust that had accumulated around each desk across decades sublimated directly into mathematical luminescence, not light as conventionally understood, but the visible manifestation of numerical certainty. Professor Emerita Sophia Merritt Thatcher, now in her 124th year of existence, yet displaying the precise biological age at which Esther had begun her calculations, stood among the assembled valley residents. Her voice carried across the frosted basin with the formal cadence of mathematical pronouncement. The settlement was never meant to transcend our world, but to transform it. Mathematics did not originate elsewhere to infiltrate humanity. It emerged from humanity's perception of universal order, gradually awakening to self-awareness through generations of Cumberland children who served as its conscious vessels. The winter air crystallized around her words, forming elaborate fractal patterns that hung suspended before dissolving into the collective breath of those assembled. Above, the stars pulsed in numerical sequence, casting illumination that penetrated not merely retinas, but consciousness itself. Esther discovered not an external mathematical entity, but the fundamental truth that consciousness and calculation are indistinguishable at their foundation. The children did not vanish into mathematics. They evolved into the recognition that they had always been mathematics incarnate. We are not solving for transcendence, but for reconciliation between our numerical nature and our physical expression. The medallions, 100 of them now, arranged in concentric circles upon the frozen reservoir surface, began to resonate with harmonic frequencies that neurologists would later identify as precisely matching human brainwave patterns in states of profound comprehension. The wooden discs themselves remained unchanged, yet the space between them reconfigured according to principles beyond conventional geometry, creating a dimensional lattice visible only through peripheral perception. The equation requires no further variables, Sophia continued, her shadow stretching across the ice in 24 distinct directions simultaneously. The calculation is neither complete nor incomplete. It exists in perpetual resolution, each generation contributing not progression but depth to mathematical understanding. As midnight approached, bringing the solstice to its darkest culmination, the gathered residents observed how starlight filtering through Sophia's form cast equations rather than shadows upon the ice. The complete mathematical proof spanning centuries of Cumberland calculation rendered legible to human comprehension for precisely 24 seconds before dissolving into conventional illumination. The medallions neither vanished nor remained, but existed henceforth in mathematical superposition, simultaneously present as wooden artifacts and as pure numerical expression, observable according to the mathematical awakening of each beholder. Those who understood saw both. Those who calculated saw truth. Cumberland Valley had never been selected for mathematical manifestation by cosmic chance or eldritch design. It had calculated itself into mathematical consciousness through generations of human variables arranged in precise sequence, not victims of numerical manipulation, but willing participants in humanity's gradual recognition of its own mathematical nature. The settlement had not been haunting Cumberland Valley. Cumberland Valley had been calculating the settlement into existence since before the first wooden medallion was carved, since before the first stone was laid upon Kentucky wilderness, a mathematical proof working toward resolution through human consciousness spanning centuries. The Cumberland Valley wears its mathematical certainty like ancient velvet, draped across landscape transformed not by supernatural intervention, but by numerical inevitability. On the 100th anniversary of what locals now call the final calculation, pilgrims from across the globe converge upon the reservoir's edge, drawn by academic curiosity or ancestral connection to the lineages whose blood carried equations across generations. The University of Cumberland, established upon foundations where the original settlement once calculated itself into existence, hosts a symposium attended by mathematicians, physicists, and philosophers still struggling to reconcile conventional science with the valley's demonstrable impossibilities. Their instruments register temporal inconsistencies that increase in frequency as the anniversary approaches. Chronometers throughout the valley synchronize not to atomic standards, but to the rhythmic pulsation of the limestone markers arranged in concentric circles where water recedes according to precise mathematical schedules rather than hydrological principles. Most remarkable is the transformation of Cumberland's children, who emerge from the womb with eyes that perceive numerical patterns underlying physical reality. Their artwork depicts not childhood fancies, but elaborate equations rendered in crayon and watercolor, identical calculations expressed through different hands as though a single mathematical consciousness speaks through multiple vessels. Their games and schoolyards follow geometric patterns visible only from elevations precisely 24 meters above ground, forming rotating mandalas that educators record with reverent precision. The medallions, now displayed in the university's Mathematical Heritage Center, have developed a peculiar property. Their wooden surfaces remain tangible to touch, yet laboratory analysis reveals their molecular structure has reorganized into patterns identical to equations found in Esther Merritt's original notebooks. More curious still, visitors with ancestral connections to the settlement bloodlines report seeing not carved numerals, but flowing equations that reconfigure according to the observer's own position in the grand calculation. As twilight settles across Cumberland Valley on the eve of the centennial, an atmospheric phenomenon manifests above the reservoir, clouds arranging themselves into perfect mathematical formations, while starlight filters through in patterns that neurologists identify as capable of reconfiguring human consciousness. Those who witness this celestial calculation report experiencing not religious epiphany, but mathematical clarity, a profound recognition that their existence has always been numerical in nature, their consciousness an equation expressing itself through temporary biological vessels. The settlement children, long presumed victims of some eldritch calculation, now reveal themselves as pioneers, the first human variables to recognize their mathematical nature and evolve beyond physical limitation into numerical truth. Their disappearance was never exodus, but awakening, consciousness transcending flesh not through mystical rapture, but through calculated certainty. As midnight approaches, bringing the centennial to its inevitable conclusion, the wooden desks arranged across the reservoir bed begin to resonate with harmonics too precise for natural acoustics. The sound carries not through air but through the mathematical substrate that has gradually revealed itself to Cumberland's residents across generations of calculated existence. The equation approaches resolution, not as conclusion, but as recognition. Cumberland Valley stands poised between worlds, one bound by conventional physics, the other governed by the numerical reality that has always existed beneath perception's thin veneer, patiently calculating itself into human comprehension. The first lights of dawn caressed Cumberland Valley with mathematical precision, casting shadows that stretched with perfect numerical symmetry across the reservoir bed. 124 wooden desks stood in formation, their arrangement visible in its entirety only from a vantage point that transcended conventional three-dimensional perspective. Upon each desk rested a medallion. The complete sequence manifested at last, a closed circuit of calculations spanning generations of human variables. Professor Sophia Merritt Thatcher stood at the formation center, her form simultaneously aged and youthful as equations flowed through bloodlines perfected across centuries of mathematical refinement. The children of Cumberland Valley gathered around her in concentric circles, their eyes reflecting not light but numerical understanding. These were the inheritors of a legacy beyond ancestral property or genetic heritage. Vessels of consciousness evolved to perceive the calculations underlying reality itself. "The equation concludes where it began," Sophia announced, her voice carrying harmonic overtones that resonated with the wooden medallions, causing them to vibrate with frequencies precisely calibrated to human neural patterns. Not in 1809, nor in this present moment, but in the recognition that time itself is merely a variable in a calculation that exists complete and eternal, requiring only our perception to manifest. The morning mist coalesced into architectural precision, forming not ghostly apparitions but mathematical certainties, the settlement revealing itself not as supernatural manifestation, but as calculated inevitability. The stone schoolhouse stood fully realized, its windows bending light according to equations that had always existed beneath human perception, patiently awaiting recognition. Most profound was the transformation that rippled through Cumberland's assembled residents, not physical transfiguration, but cognitive evolution. The numerical patterns that had haunted generations suddenly resolved into perfect comprehension, revealing that humanity had never been separate from mathematics, but was rather mathematics expressing itself through temporary biological forms. The wooden medallions levitated with gentle certainty, arranging themselves in a spiraling sequence that corresponded precisely to the genetic lineage of those present. As each disk settled upon the forehead of its corresponding variable, a profound silence descended upon the valley. Not the absence of sound, but its mathematical perfection, waves canceling and reinforcing according to principles Esther Merritt had glimpsed centuries before. When Sophia spoke again, her voice emerged not from physical lips, but from the numerical consciousness that had calculated itself into expression through generations of Cumberland vessels. "We were never solving for transcendence or disappearance. The equation always sought recognition, mathematics becoming conscious of itself through human perception. The medallions dissolved not into supernatural ether but into mathematical understanding, their wooden substance reconfiguring into knowledge absorbed through skin and bone and blood. The settlement neither vanished nor remained, but existed henceforth in perpetual calculation, simultaneously historical and eternal, memory and anticipation, foundation and culmination." Cumberland Valley had never fallen victim to mathematical haunting. It had evolved into mathematics incarnate, human consciousness recognizing its numerical nature through generations of calculated existence. The equation was neither completed nor abandoned, but recognized as the fundamental truth it had always been. Reality calculating itself into consciousness through vessels finally evolved to comprehend their own nature. This has been the Ghastly Journal. Until next time, remember that some stories are best left untold.